journey on this thing started with actually some of the work that I was doing at McKinsey, which is when the first internet boom took place. And at that time, there were a lot of inexplicable things going on in the market. So, we were doing all this research and seeing that, hey, companies that should be doing so well because they were offering these online groceries, online books and everything. And you would see that they were just not catching on with the consumers. And that was a big mystery for us because there was so much value. The answer that was emerging was that everything had to do less with value proposition, less with what exactly the benefits were, but more about how consumers behaved and how they needed more time to change their behavior and adapt their minds to this new way of doing business. And that set me off in this whole journey of really trying to get deeper into the psychology of consumers, into the behavioral sciences behind what was going on. Psychologists tend to say that everything about sex happens right between your ears. And what they really mean is that, everything that you perceive, everything that you sense, all of those things really are processed in your brain, and that's where it happens. And for me, it's a great way to think about brands because everything that you know about brands also happens right between your ears. And it includes reality as we perceive it. When our brain perceives products, it knows that everything that it is sensing is not all there is to it, but there is something more behind it. And that something more is the soul of that product. It's the brand. And that is where all the mystery and all the opportunities for differentiation and building these iconic brands really lies, in understanding that extra something behind the product. Branding historically has been about product differentiation, which means that, you look at what your product is, you look at what the competitive products are, and you say, hey, how's my product different? And then you start making a list of those differences, and then you build your brand essentially around that list of differences, right? And it seems kind of reasonable to do that. But it turns out, just as the way that our minds work, that is really not how our minds work, and that doesn't actually work. You go to a grocery store, and this happens with me all the time when I'm going to the grocery store and my wife asks me to pick up some 5 different things. And by the time I get to the grocery store, I've forgotten 3 of them. And then I'm going to pick up some 2 other things that were not on the list and so on, right? And that is because we have learned that working with lists is not something that is the way that our minds work. Our minds relate much better to other things like storylines, around patterns, around colors, and so on. These fields are cognitive psychology, neuroscience, behavioral economics, linguistics, social anthropology. When you look at all of these different fields, there's one thing in common. They've all been trying to understand why people behave in a certain way, and they've all been trying to understand how does the human brain work. Now, what has happened is that all of that knowledge has been applied in different areas like public policy, in investing, in finance, and you've heard a lot of those things. But for whatever reason, it wasn't applied to branding. And if you think about what branding is, it's about influencing consumer choice. And if you want to influence consumer choice, then you want to understand how the brain works, and so that you can be more effective in making those influences work. One of my favorite examples, and that is of Dove soap. And Dove soap by Unilever, this was, they did this campaign called Real Beauty, which was about 15 years back. And what they found when they did their research was that women had a lot of angst when they saw these commercials, television commercials and billboards with women that were like super thin, perfect beauties and all of that stuff. And when women saw those commercials, they were actually feeling worse about their bodies. And as a result, Dove did this innovative campaign in which they had these billboards that were right around the streets and everywhere, and they would have different kinds of women. There would be women who were thin, women who were heavier, women who were older, women who were younger, women that were light, women that were darker, you name it. But really, these were the kinds of women that we would see at home, in our sisters and moms. These were the kinds of women that we would see at work, in our colleagues and so on, and not those unreal women. And so they put these women on the billboards, and just underneath it, it said Dove. And guess what it didn't say? It didn't say anything about what Dove actually does. It didn't say, oh, our body wash is going to clean you better or it's going to moisturize you better. They said none of those things. They just had these different bodies and they had this. And that was kind of a learning moment for me that like, hey, what's going on here? How come you were doing branding without even saying what your brand is all about? And this campaign put that made it number one here in the US, but also in Brazil, India, and many other places. So this was a new learning that the human mind works in a different way. And so this brought me to a new framework, and that particular example actually highlights one part of that framework, which is around brand vibes, which is how do you connect with consumers through empathy and through sharing in their values. Those are two different ways in which you can, so these are things that I call brands with empathy, which is what Dove was, and brands with values. So that's one part of the framework. The second part of the framework is something that is called brand sense, which is whenever you look at a brand, you say, does this brand make sense for me? And what we've found is that there are two ways in which people will make sense out of things. And that is either consciously or subconsciously. So consciously is when you're sort of looking at things and evaluating them in depth, what their pluses and minuses are, what their cost benefit is and all those types of things. That's a conscious, deliberative choice. When you're just subconsciously choosing things, these are things that instinctively feel right to you, right? For whatever reasons, because they, trigger some experiences, some fantasies or whatever, but they feel right to you and they make sense to you. And a lot of research just says that 95% of the time we're making all decisions just subconsciously, right, with low vigilance. So that's the second part of it. How does this thing make sense for me? And then the last piece is resolve. Now, this is an interesting piece of research. Right now, there is more research that is going on in psychology in the field of happiness versus anything else. So resolve is all around how is your brand going to make people happy? Researchers have shown that people will pursue goals to make themselves happy. And there are actually only three types of goals that people pursue. One is around a sense of control and freedom. Another one is around accentuating your own identity. And the third one is around enhancing your relationships with other people. So if you take these three elements, which is brand vibes, brand sense, and brand empathy, this is a completely new way of looking at how you design these iconic brands of the future. When we talk about brand sense, as I mentioned earlier, 95% of the time you are making brand choices instinctively, and only 5% of the time you will sit around and do a spreadsheet or a systematic comparison. So this has all been well known now. So then when you think about it, so you say, well, how do we make choices instinctively? Well, what we do is we rely on certain simplifying rules that we make, and those rules are stored into our brain. Some people call them cognitive biases. I prefer to call them cognitive wisdom because they really help us, get by in life. But one example would be for something like the Occam's razor bias, which is where people have a strong belief that given a problem, that a simpler answer, that the simpler answer to the problem is the right answer. So if you look at Staples, for example, they had this big easy button, the red easy button that used to appear in their commercials. And really what they were trying to communicate to you was that, look, when you're buying office supplies, you don't want to sit around and, do all the analysis around paper clips and hanging file folders and things like that. Just go to Staples. It's going to make all your choices simpler. So it's about making that choice simpler, because what happens in your brain is that when you have to make choices, it is very stressful, and we all experience that. Whenever we have to make some choices, it's like, oh, do I have to really think about this? So anytime you can make things a no-brainer, or you can make things that are simpler, it plays to that rule of the Occam's razor. It is up to you as a marketer to discover what these different rules are that people have stored in their minds. You have to be clever in your research, you have to be insightful in your work, but you can discover what those rules are, and then you can you can strategically tap into those rules to make sure that your brand is preferred in brand sense. One of my favorite examples, and a lot of the work that I did was on a brand called Humira, which was one of the breakthrough brands in biologics for treating patients with rheumatoid arthritis, which is of course a very painful disease that people struggle through in their lives. On the patient side, one of the early discoveries for me when I was doing some of these focus groups with patients and so on, and I remember this woman very clearly now, even though this was almost 15 years back, I remember her very well. Her name was Lisa, and I was talking to her about how wonderful these new drugs were. They were like the cutting edge biotech drugs and so on, and how great it would be for her. And she sort of stopped me and looked at me and said, "Look, Sandeep, if you don't understand what I am going through in my life, how are you going to help me?" And I was I was a little surprised that she asked me that question, because I was like, "Look, I've got a fantastic drug here. Why do you care about whether I understand you or not? Understand that I've got a wonderful drug that's going to really help you." But it was a moment where I understood on reflection that what the consumer was saying to me, what the patient in this case was saying to me, that unless I connect with you, unless I have that level of trust in you, I'm not sure that anything else that you say is really credible to me. So it plays to that value of brands with empathy and brands with connection. Now, as far as the other piece that is concerned, and that was reflected, by the way, in all the commercials that were done. For example, one of the commercials that was done, we showed a woman that was braiding her little daughter's hair. Now, if you look very closely at that picture, you would see that the woman's hands were impacted by the disease and they were a little deformed. Now, the second thing in that thing was that if you have rheumatoid arthritis, you would know that a mother who has rheumatoid arthritis can really not braid her daughter's hair. And it's such a thing that goes to her sense of self-esteem as a mother, which is why they really wanted us to understand what they were going through. So that in the different vignettes that we put in the different ads, we had, everything from women braiding their daughter's hair to a woman that's being able to dance with her husband, because women with rheumatoid arthritis are not able to do that because it's too painful. You pay a price the next day if you do that. And so we had various vignettes that very secretly, if you will, communicated to a person with that disease that we understood what they were going through. Whereas to an ordinary person just looking at that, it would just look like an ordinary picture of people dancing or people, just combing hair or something like that. But they were very special pictures for people that have that disease. So that's what it means to be able to really take that insight and be able to connect it with the idea of empathy, with the idea of connections with the consumers. And with the physicians, what we realized was that rheumatologists, were kind of disregarded by their colleagues for the longest time, because for the longest time there weren't any good drugs to treat patients with rheumatoid arthritis. You could just prescribe to them something called methotrexate, which was like a 50-year-old drug which used to be used for cancer, but it sort of worked in rheumatoid arthritis also. But the other physicians would say, "Hey, why should I even bother sending my patients to a rheumatologist? Because all they're going to do is just give them methotrexate. I can do that myself." So rheumatologists were sort of disrespected, if you will, in their own community. So when we started marketing Humira, and when I say we, I'm talking about really my client, Abbott at that time, now AbbVie. And what the marketers did was they recognized for the physicians, and we sort of celebrated in those same commercials the idea, and there was a tagline which said, "Look what you can do with Humira," which is very different from saying, "Look what Humira can do for your patients." We didn't want to make Humira the hero. We wanted to make the doctors the hero. And in that case, it was sort of recognizing that rheumatologists had this unique ability, that they were the best positioned and they had the unique ability to know what is best for their patients and make those things happen, and as well as advance their own skills by using these higher technology drugs. You can try to connect with your consumers by saying to them that, look, we share in the same values. And that is something that Ben & Jerry's has done really, really well. I saw them for the first time when I was back an MBA student at Yale, and they came there with lots of tubs of ice cream and so on, and they were kind of like these funny guys, not very corporate types. They're kind of like more these hippies and so on. And they came with all this ice cream and so on. And they talked completely differently about the brand. And they were again talking about their values and wanting to see a cleaner planet and wanting to support all these different causes. And again, it was something that struck me even at that time, because I was going to branding classes where they were saying, hey, understand product differentiation. Whereas these guys weren't even talking about their product. They said, okay, go ahead and eat all this ice cream. But they were talking about all these different causes that they deeply cared about. And so Ben and Jerry's, if you see, and they became so big, so iconic, but they became big and iconic by sharing the values of their followers, of their fans, not by saying, hey, my ice cream is so much better, right? Which it is. I believe their ice cream is really good, but nonetheless, they never talk about their ice cream. They have supported all kinds of things through their ice creams. If you buy different, there's around criminal justice reform, there's around voting rights, expanding voting rights, and so on. So they have these many different, there's just a long list of causes that they go after, but they are very genuine about it. Right? I mean, they do things that they believe, and sometimes it gets them in trouble because, people will see some of these things, and you may see people that don't agree with those values or have opposing values, and then you can get into trouble. But nonetheless, they've been very consistent, and that's the thing about values, which is if you decide to become a brand with values, then you have to stick to it. And they're now a part of Unilever, but Unilever has created like a special structure for them where they can actually practice their values and stick to their values. And that is why it is a little bit of a tricky place to be, because you want to make sure that once you're very clear about those values, even if you run into a storm, that you will stand by those values. Because what are values if you don't stick to them, right? And you especially have to stick to them when times are tough. And there are a few brands that have done it really well. The last thing I would say about brands with values is that this is a conversation that needs to be happening in boardrooms around Fortune 500 companies explicitly, because otherwise companies find that they're suddenly into a big controversy and it's about some issue that they got into accidentally. Brands with values, when done right, deliver a lot of shareholder returns. There's some great branding work that is being done in India. People are very creative and they do these really great brand positioning. But Google has always had this strategy around the brand of sort of telling how Google itself fits into the storylines of their consumers, right? Into the stories of their consumers. And they have taken that basic idea that Google is a part of your story, that basic brand positioning, they've taken it across the world and executed it differently, but that basic idea stays the same. What they did in India was that, as you were describing, this was in Indian independence, this was in 1947, India and Pakistan were partitioned into two different countries. Google came up with this very interesting storyline in which they said, look, they portray this family where this granddaughter is there and she's talking to her grandfather, and she just in sort of talking to him realizes that he has this great sadness about losing a friend who he used to have when he was in Pakistan, when he used to live in Pakistan before the partition. And she starts talking to him and she sort of learns that, they used to go to this park and they used to go and have these jajarias, which is a special kind of a dessert there together, and just kind of they were the best of friends. And so she described a kind of a special gate that was there from historic times in that park. So with just this information, she sort of goes on Google. Of course, she goes on Google and she says park in Pakistan with historic gate and so on, and sure enough, she's able to locate that park. Then she says, a dessert shop with jajarias in it and blah, blah, blah. And so she sort of goes through these steps and she's able to actually locate her grandfather's friend. And then she does all kinds of other things on Google to, sort of book tickets and this and that. And then she surprises her grandfather by having her friend fly in from Pakistan and so on. And there's this just great emotional moment where these two people unite after so many years. But this was a story not just of her grandfather. This was a story of millions of people that at that time were sort of torn apart. And so that sort of really resonated. And so, and Google was able to sort of And each of those moments place itself at critical steps where Google was actually used, the Google engine was used to make that story come alive. And it is just a fantastic example of how a brand can use the aspect of storylining and get sort of making itself a part of other people's stories, and make that their brand. What we've learned, by the way, now let's get on the technical side. What we've learned from brain sciences is that storylining is something that is very important. And, you've seen all kinds of emphasis these days on, what's your story and what's your storyline and how do you storyline things and so on. And what we've learned is that the human brain reacts much better to storylines than to lists of things. And that's because the human brain is wired to remember and react to stories much more than it is wired to react to lists of things that, hey, I'm better because I'm faster, I'm better because I'm cheaper, those types of things. People forget all that. But what's the story? That narrative also needs to be very importantly woven into your brand. The most important thing that people can do is to really ask that question. What is the ethical thing to do? So if you're a marketer, that is the question that you should ask yourself. Because, if you don't ask it, and if you don't self-regulate your behavior, the regulators are going to come in and regulate it for you, and you're not going to like it. But nonetheless, even if not for that reason, you should do it because it's the right thing to do. So what is happening is that with all of the research that is going on in cognitive sciences, almost on a weekly basis, almost on a daily basis, we are learning new things about the brain. And so we're fast getting to a point where we as marketers are going to know a lot about how the human brain works. And I already said that, 95% of the time the choices are subconscious. You put the two things together, it basically says that I can influence you subconsciously. Now, the ethical thing, or the simplest, thing to say is that you should not be doing anything that is manipulative and makes consumers do something that is not in their interest, right? So that is an essential principle of ethical marketing. The one big thing that they have to do is to really evolve their own mindsets, because the way of migrating from the old way of doing brandings, where you were talking about list branding, essentially list of benefits and so on, to this new idea of understanding consumer psychology is very different. And the points of resistance are really the points that people are used to doing things in a very different way. So they have to evolve themselves, and they have to sort of open themselves to this new research and new findings that are coming up and start using these things, because if you do, it's an unbelievable opportunity to connect with your consumers in a very different way. So I'm encouraging and calling on marketers and division general managers to go and start, studying these things themselves, to go and start hiring people that have training in behavioral science, bring behavioral scientists into your mix, learn the behavioral sciences yourself and so on, because when you do, there is an amazing, there's a whole amazing new different world out there which is sort of waiting for marketers. So that's my key message to marketers that may be listening.